Imagine for a moment that the time has not passed. You are standing in front of the ruins of the Colosseum. Meanwhile, he whined carries echoes of prayers ancient, war cries, and forgotten liturgical chants. Rome, the eternal city. Guard in its stones the scars of empires collapsed, anonymous martyrs and legendary popes. And among all the names that have marked that history, there is one that resonates like a roar through the centuries. Leon. It's not a coincidence. It's not aesthetics. It's a symbol. When the new pontiff, presented himself to the world as Leo XIV, not only did he choose a name, evoked a spiritual dynasty, a heritage millennial that melts the strength of the faith with the power of the word. 13 men before him, they carried that name. 5 of them they were canonized, and all of them left a mark that still burns beneath the dome of St. Peter's. But why Leon? In the tradition Christian, the lion represents vigilance, nobility, and courage. It is the symbol of the evangelist Mark, but also of the risen Christ, of the throne of Judah, of silent martyrdom that does not surrender. A pope who chooses this name does not seek to please, but to fight. He does not hide behind diplomacy, stands as a defender of the true. This documentary is a journey through that inheritance. We will revive the titanic figure of Leo XIV, the Pope who confronted Attila with the power of the word. We will see how Leo III crowned Charlemagne and gave birth to the Holy Roman Empire. We will feel the strain of the schism with Leo IX and the beauty, dangerous of the Renaissance with Leo X. And we will understand as Leo XIII, in the midst of an age of revolutions, offered a Catholic vision of the modern world. But it's not just history, it's a warning. Each Pope Leo embodies a conflict, an era, a struggle. His name is a reminder. The faith is not neutral. It is spiritual combat. It is living doctrine. It is resistance. And when Leo XIV pronounced his name before the crew in St. Peter's Square, not only yielded tribute to his predecessors, he declared, in a low but firm voice, "Battle continues. This is the call of the lions." And you, viewer, are about to begin a journey that goes beyond the books and dates, a journey that crosses the soul of the church and the foundations of the civilization Western. Because sometimes, to understand the present, you have to listen the roars of the past. Year 452. The shadow of the destruction looms over Italy. The hordes of Attila, the called Scourge of God, they advance relentless, leaving behind him cities reduced to ashes, temples looted, and villages integers kneeling before terror. Rome, the jewel of the empire, prepares for it inevitable, the looting, the humiliation, the end. And then it happens, it unthinkable. It is not a general who stands in the way, in the path of the conqueror. It is not an army. It is a man dressed in white, riding a mule, accompanied by a few. His name, Lion, his weapon, the word, Saint Leo. Known as Leo the Great, was not just a pope. He was a spiritual strategist, a leader in times of chaos, and one of the pillars of the church in the most critical era of his history. Elected pontiff in the year 440, in half of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, became in the rock, where many they searched shelter while the ancient world was falling apart. His meeting with Attila has passed to the history as one of the most enigmatic and powerful moments of the papacy. It is not known with certainty what words used. Some chroniclers speak of supernatural visions, others of shrewd negotiation. But it is true that, after that meeting, the king of the Huns gave average return. Rome was saved. But Leon did not only face the barbarians from outside, he also fought internal battles. During his pontificate, he fought firmly the heresies that threatened the unit doctrinal of the church. He opposed Pelagianism, Nestorianism, and Monophysitism, and his influence was decisive in the Council of Chalcedon of the year 451. There, his famous letter to Flavian, known as the Tome of Leon, was acclaimed as a clear and orthodox expression of the faith Christian. The assembled bishops exclaimed, Peter has spoken by the mouth of Leo. That phrase wasn't rhetorical. With St. Leo the Great, the papacy ceased to be simply one spiritual authority among many. It became a consolidated the concept of Roman primacy, the idea that the Bishop of Rome, as successor direct from St. Peter, had supreme authority over all Christianity. It was he, birth of a power that transcended the borders and the empires. And not only in doctrine shone, Leon too reformed the liturgy, strengthened the charity in Rome, and consolidated the figure of the Pope as mediator between heaven and earth, between the empire and the town. When died in, he year 461, Rome still, she was breathing, wounded but not defeated. The figure of Leo had planted a seed, that of a church capable of resisting, of leading, of teaching. He was canonized as a saint and proclaimed Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for the giants of the theology. St. Leo the Great didn't just stop an invader. He stopped the hopelessness. His legacy lives on in every papal speech, in every defense of the truth, in every act of spiritual courage. It was the first lion, but not the last, because with he was born the roar. After the death of St. Leo the Great, the Christian world entered in a long night of transformations. Empires were fragmented, heresies persisted, and the Church was seen forced to rebuild on shaky ground. But the name Leo did not fade away. On the contrary, he returned, again and again, as a beacon of doctrinal firmness and spiritual defense. The first in taking up the legacy was Leo II, elected Pope in the year 682. His pontificate was brief, barely a year, but significant. Leo II confronted monothelitism, a heresy that held that Christ had only one will, denying his full humanity. It was he who ratified and promulgated the decisions of the Third Council of Constantinople, formally condemning that doctrine and reaffirming Christological orthodoxy. But Leo II was not only a theologian, he was also a musician and liturgist. He introduced improvements in Gregorian chant, leaving a mark in the spirituality of the Church that would resonate in the ages coming. It was, at the same time, a defender of the truth and a caretaker of the soul. More than 100 past years, until another pope was elected, he name of Leon, and when it did, the world was changing again. Leo III, elected in year 795, lived one of the most fascinating stages of the history of Europe. Under his leadership, the Church forged a decisive alliance with temporal power. It was he who, in the Christmas of the year 800, placed the imperial crown on the head of Charlemagne, giving birth to the Holy Roman Empire. That act not only consecrated a new political order, it also reaffirmed the role of the Pope as arbiter of the fate of the Christian kingdoms. But Leo III was not a puppet of the powerful. He was attacked by enemies within Rome, falsely accused and humiliated publicly. Even so, he returned with dignity, with the support of Charlemagne, and restored the order. Under his mandate, it was promoted the construction of churches. Temples were beautified and strengthened, the ecclesiastical administration. His papacy was the beginning of a new era, a synthesis between faith and power, between cross and crown. Decades later, another lion would rise, not from the palaces, but from the defensive walls. Leo IV, elected in the year 847, lived under the constant threat of Muslim attacks. Rome was no longer the imperial capital, but it remained being the heart of the Christianity. When the Saracens plundered the city of San Pedro, Leo IV did not stay in the contemplation. He organized the defense, mobilized troops, and reinforced the walls of the city. His culminating moment arrived in the Battle of Ostia in the year 849. There, the fleet Christian, blessed by the Pope, achieved a decisive victory against the invaders. It was a military triumph, yes, but also a spiritual one. A sign that the Church could not only resist in the altar, but also in the battlefield. From doctrinal orthodoxy to the holy sword of the resistance, these popes called Leo were, each in his own way, guardians of the faith, a lineage that not only taught but protected. Not all storms that threaten the church they come from abroad. Some are born within its own walls, disguised as ambition, betrayal, and moral decay. The 10th century, known as the Iron Century of the papacy, was one of the longer periods dark and convulsive in the history of the Roman See, and in the middle of that turbulence, 3 popes named Leo tried, with different successes, to bring order to chaos. Leo V, elected in the year 903, it is almost a ghost in the history. His pontificate lasted just 2 months. He was not overthrown by external enemies, but by one of the Yaws, the cleric Christopher, who it imprisoned and usurped Peter's throne. Some accounts claim that Leo was murdered in prison, although the sources are fragmentary. Be that as it may, their name was left engraved as a symbol of the fragility of the papacy in times of extreme corruption. The chaos continued until, decades later, Leo VI assumed the papal throne in the year 928. His brief pontificate also developed under the shadow of aristocratic families who controlled the church as if it were a personal fiefdom. Leo VI attempted to stabilize the ecclesiastical government, but its action was limited and its death passed almost unnoticed. However, a small light began to shine with Leo VII, elected in 936. Although also he ruled for a short time, but he stood out for something crucial: his support for Cluniac monasticism, a movement that sought to restore purity and discipline in monastic life. In an era marked by nepotism, the simony, and clerical abuse, this initiative was like a whisper of renewal among the rubble. Leo VII also worked to improve the conduct of the clergy and promote the obedience to canonical norms. He did not achieve a general reform. The ground was still too arid, but he sowed seeds that centuries later would bear fruit. These popes did not shine like the great lions before them, but they faced another type of enemy, the internal decomposition. And although his past, it was brief, reminding us his existence is essential to understand that sometimes heroism also consists of resist without glory, maintain the flame lit when all seems lost. In the middle of the 11th century, the Catholic Church was on the verge of moral collapse. The episcopal sees were sold as merchandise. Priestly celibacy was ignored. Simony corrupted every corner of the clergy, and many monasteries were controlled by lords feudal without spiritual interest. The Christian ideal was fading under the weight of secular power. And then, as a lightning over the swamp, appeared Leo IX, Bruno of Egisheim-Dagsburg. He was elected pope in 1049. He did not accept the election immediately. He demanded that the people and the Roman clergy will confirm personally, a symbolic action that marked the beginning of his pontificate, restore the dignity from the throne of Peter with legitimacy and reformist fervor. From the first day, Leo IX became interface of the Cluniac reform, a monastic movement born in France that promoted poverty, the chastity and the obedience as an antidote to clerical corruption. He did not rule from the comfort of the Vatican. He traveled extensively throughout Europe, convened synods, confronted abuses, and excommunicated corrupt bishops without fear. Their message was clear. The Church, she had to become a saint again, or she would die of decay. But his struggle was not only moral, it was also doctrinal and geopolitical. In the year 1054, under his leadership, one of the occurred most painful episodes of the history Christian, the Eastern Schism, which definitively separated the Roman Catholic Church of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Although Leo IX died before seeing the consummation of the break, was he who shipment the delegation that would place the bull of excommunication on the altar of Saint Sophia in Constantinople. It was an act of authority, but also of rupture. It wasn't just arrogance. For Leo IX, preserving the unit doctrinal was essential, but the centuries of cultural, political, and theological differences with Byzantium already were an abyss. Their attempt at dialogue ended in confrontation, and the Christianity was never again one. On the domestic front, Leo IX profoundly reformed the Roman Curia, professionalizing it and cleansing it of nepotism. He strengthened the centralization of papal power and set the foundations of what would be the medieval papacy, a throne not only spiritual but also diplomatic and judicial. It was not an easy man. His character was strong, his vision unyielding, but in an era in which many they preferred keep quiet to preserve his power, he roared. He roared against the hypocrisy, against the sale of the sacred, against the spiritual mediocrity. Died in 1054, the same year of the schism, exhausted by his travels and battles. But he left behind a legacy of fire, that of a church that could be purified, even if had to go through he pain to achieve it. Leo IX was not just a reformer, he was a warrior, a pope who understood that holiness, you don't beg, you conquer. The splendor of the Renaissance flooded Europe. Art flourished, cities were filled with domes, marble and poetry. Rome was reborn as the cultural center of the world, but under that beauty a crisis was throbbing that no one seemed to want to look. And in the middle of that contradiction, ascended to the throne of Peter Leo VI, a pope who embodied the perfection, both the splendor and the tragedy of its time. Born Giovanni de' Medici, belonged to one of the richest and most powerful families in Florence. He was elected pope in 1513 at just 37 years old. His pontificate represents the last moment of unity in the Christendom Western, before the storm that would divide the faith of millions. Leo VI was not a theologian nor a reformer. He was a patron, an art lover, an accomplished diplomat. Under his sponsorship, Rome experienced a second golden age. Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante, all found in he a protector. St. Peter's Basilica began to rise as a symbol of eternal glory, but that glory had a price. To finance the monumental works, the sale of indulgences was used, a system that allowed the faithful obtain forgiveness of sins through financial donations. It was not a practice new, but under Leo VI, it reached scandalous levels. And that was precisely what it was, what triggered the rebellion. In 1517, a monk Augustinian called Martin Luther, he nailed his 95 theses in Wittenberg, defying the papal authority and questioning the indulgences. Leo VI underestimated him. He thought he was just another agitator. But in 1521, the Pope found himself forced to act. He excommunicated Luther, not knowing that this action would give origin of a revolution unstoppable. While Rome was celebrating banquets, Germany was burning in theological debates. The Protestant Reformation there was started, and with he end of the Catholic unity in Europe. Leo VI died in 1521, the same year in which he signed the bull Decet Romanum Pontificem contra Luther. For some, it was a negligent pope. For others, a symbol of an era that could not see its own end. Was the last lion before the great break, the last pope to reign over a seemingly united but internally fractured church. Under his smile, Renaissance man was hiding a system that could no longer hold on. Leo VI did not fall because of his love of art, but because he ignored the cry of the soul. After the storm caused by the Reformation, the throne of Peter lived on centuries of reconstruction, internal conflicts, and ideological disputes. In amidst this changing landscape, the name Lion, it resounded again, albeit for brief moments, in the figure of two popes who, with paths very different, they offered an unexpected echo of the past. Leo XV, elected in April 1605, had one of the shortest pontificates of the history, just 27 days. His health was fragile, but the intention was clear, to continue the line of moral and ecclesiastical reform initiated by his predecessors of the Council of Trent. He came from a family noble, the Medici, like Leo VI, but he did not share his love for pomp. Remember, as an austere man, deeply spiritual and a declared enemy of nepotism. Although he did not have time to implement changes, your choice symbolized a hope, that of a pope who, from the humility, will seek to purify the church. A century later, in 1823, Leo XIV ascended to the papacy in the midst of the post-Napoleonic era. The world was changing rapidly, revolutions, secularism, new ideals of freedom. In the face of that wave of modernity, Leo XIV chose the resistance. It was a severe, conservative, obsessed pope with restoring the spiritual authority in a time that defied all tradition. He fought illiberalism, restricted certain freedoms within the papal states, and reinforced the role of the Church as an absolute moral guide. Many it considered retrograde, but for others it was a retaining wall against the collapse of values. Both popes, they shared something essential, the silent warning that the world could slide toward the abyss if it was abandoned. The spiritual root. One died too soon. The other fought against him time. But the two, with their gestures, made it clear that the name Leon still, he carried the weight of the fight with him. In 1878, when Leo XIII was elected pope, the world no longer looked the same, nothing like what their predecessors had known. The 19th century had witnessed the rise of secularism, political revolutions, and the loss of the papal states, and the relentless advance of the modern ideologies. The Church, it seemed, cornered, reduced to a spiritual island in half an ocean of secularization. But Leo XIII did not shut himself away. In the melancholy, neither chose frontal combat. He chose a more difficult path, the intelligence. Born as Vincenzo Gioacchino Pecci, he was a man of great philosophical and political training. His choice frame, he beginning of a pontificate that would last 25 years, one of the longest in the history, and without doubt one of the most productive doctrinally. Under his leadership, the Church not only resisted, but rose again with a new voice. Leo XIII understood that it was not enough with condemning the errors of the modern world. They had to be confronted with reason, depth, and clear proposals. That's why impulse, a renaissance of the Thomistic thought, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, as a basis for dialogue between faith and reason. But his most lasting legacy was, without doubt, your social doctrine. In 1891, he published the encyclical Rerum Novarum, a revolutionary document in the one who boarded he conflict between capital and work, condemned both communism and savage capitalism, and defended the rights of the workers, the dignity of the work, and the need for an economy with a Christian soul. It was he, official birth of the social doctrine of the Church, which still today continues to guide his action in the world. Leo XIII also faced without fear of the Freemasonry, moral relativism, and atheistic scientism. Without decline, he progressed true. He stated that the Church was not there against the science, but against its ideological usurpation. He maintained diplomatic relations with governments' complexes, promoted the Catholic education, defended the religious freedom, and all without losing its doctrinal firmness. It was a man of the 19th century with vision of the 21st century. Old, frail, and thin, he became into a figure of enormous spiritual authority. His portrait was hung in universities, monasteries, even in secular homes. It did not impose with force, but with coherence, clarity, and depth. It was one he respected even from those who did not share his faith. Under his pontificate, the Church stopped being seen as an enemy of the progress and began to present itself as a critical conscience of the modern world. When died in 1903, the world had changed again, but thanks to him, the Church was prepared. There was a bridge between the tradition and the future. Leo XIII was not a warrior, neither a martyr. It was something rarer still, a wise man, an architect invisible who knew redesign the Church without destroying its essence, a lion that did not roar, but whose words still resonate. When, before an expectant crowd in St. Peter's Square, the new pope presented himself to the world as Leo XIV, not only revealing his identity, sent a message. After more than a century without a pope who would carry that name, the choice cannot understand oneself as a simple gesture. In the history of the papacy, the names are statements, and that of Leon carries a deep symbolic weight: defense, wisdom, reform, courage. When choosing to call oneself Leo, this new pontiff consciously places himself in the firing line, a legacy of popes who faced heresies, invasions, ruptures, moral decay, and ideological challenges. From Saint Leo the Great confronting Attila to Leo the Thien dialoguing with the modernity, each one left marks that defined the course of the Church. What does it mean, then, to be a lion in the 21st century? It means assuming that the throne of Peter is no longer just a spiritual chair, but also a bastion of resistance in a fragmented world. It means proclaiming uncomfortable truths in times of relativism. It means leading without fear of a humanity increasingly lost in the moral uncertainty. Leo XIII doesn't just inherit a chair, he inherits a roar. One that it calls to be firm without being harsh, wise without being distant, brave without being reckless. One who challenges us to be a pastor, teacher, and sentinel of a church that still has much to say to the world. And when choosing that name, also invites us, all of us, to look back, not out of nostalgia, but to remember who we were and who we are called to be. Throughout the centuries, 13 men they chose be called Lion. Some shone like beacons in the darkness. Others barely left a trail in the sand of the time. But everyone, in some way, they embodied the tension between power and faith, between the fall of the world and the eternal hope. 5 were saints. One stopped Attila, another crowned an emperor. One fought the corruption, another the heresy. One faced the modern colossus with the wisdom of the ancient. Each one was response to a crisis. Each one was roared in a time that needed hear. Today, with Leo XIV, that tradition revives. But the challenge is still elderly. We live in an era where the truth is questioned, the spirituality diluted, and the church observed with a magnifying glass. The history of the lions reminds us that there is no papacy without struggle, that there is no living faith without test, and that each generation needs its own guardians. But this story doesn't end in Rome. It also calls us, are we willing to know our roots, to understand the challenges they faced our shepherds so that today we can live our faith? Because knowing the history of the popes of Leon is not just about studying he passed. It is looking in the mirror and asking ourselves, what if the missing roar was he are? If this story inspired you, don't leave. Without leave your brand, like, subscribe and comment which Papa Leo impacted you the most and why. Together, let's continue exploring the secrets, the battles, and the greatness of a church that never stopped roaring.